الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله ومن والاه أما بعد. uh, Chapter 5 Al-Tadawi bil-Muharramat, treatment with religiously prohibited substances. Right, so we all know one of the greatest gifts of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is our well-being and health, but usually most people take it for granted until they get sick. From it, the hadith, اثنان مغبون فيه كثير من الناس. There are two things that most people take for granted. الصحة والفراغ, that is health and well-being and free time. And so you don't really appreciate these things until you no longer have them, and then you're always in chase for them, right? And so once a person loses their health, right, they're always in this figure and always wanting to restore it. And sometimes what can happen is they might end up using something that is forbidden in the Sharia in order to restore that ni'mah that they lost because of their negligence. So, what do we mean by muharramat? What are those religiously prohibited things through which medication generally is not permissible? But in some cases, there might be exceptions to that. Well, muharramat is basically anything whose use is haram, whether in the form of medicine or something else. This includes impure things, poisonous things, potentially harmful things, and some things that might be pure in themselves, yet their use has been prohibited by the Sharia. For example, the use of silk for men, or gold and silver if it's for the sake of consumption. Right? So these things, although they're pure but have been made haram in the Sharia. So what is the hukum of tadawi bil muharramat, medication using such prohibited substances? Well, there's a general agreement amongst the jurists that in normal circumstances, it is forbidden for a person to use such substances for medication. Right? So if there's no zarura, there's no necessity, and also you don't have a mubah alternative to it, a permissible alternative to it, then it won't be permissible for you to use al-muharram. So the hadith of the Prophet alayhi salam, he says, "Inna Allah lam yaj'al shifa'akum fima harrama alaykum," that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not made your shifa and has not placed the cure in that which He has made forbidden on you. And in other hadith, this one's mentioned in Abu Dawud, he mentions, "Inna Allah anzala ad-da'a wad-dawa," where the Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has sent down both the disease and its cure. وَجَعَلَ لِكُلِّ دَاءٍ دَوَاءً, and He has made for every disease a cure. فَتَدَاوَوْا, so you should take treatment. You should seek the cure. وَلَا تَتَدَاوَوْا بِحَرَامٍ, but although you should seek cure, you should not seek it through forbidden means. And so this was a general instruction from the Prophet ﷺ. And for this very reason, the Fatwa Committee, the Permanent Fatwa Committee in Saudi Arabia, they state that treatment with forbidden materials is not permissible because of the sacred text indicating prohibition of this. Now, there are some cases in which there is a necessity, and if such a case occurs, then it may be permissible, but that's conditioned with fulfilling some requirements. First of which is that A competent, trustworthy Muslim physician informs you that this prohibited substances is a cure for the sickness. Number two is that it should have been scientifically or by personal experience been demonstrated that the use of this prohibited substances is generally safe. If the harms outweigh the benefits, then it won't be permissible. And the third condition is that there should not be a religiously permissible alternative and substitute for the substance in question. Because if you have an alternative, then there's no longer a need to use this forbidden substance, right? And when we mean by there should not be an alternative, it does not necessarily mean that there shouldn't be a substitute out there. I mean, it's possible that there is a halal permissible medication, but the patient is unable to access it. Maybe it's not available in their region, or it is, but it is so expensive that it's out of their financial reach. Or maybe it is halal, but for that patient specifically, uh, it might be harmful because it might have some content which they're allergic to. So, whatever reason, uh, a person cannot use a halal alternative, then meeting these other conditions, some fuqaha suggest that it is permissible for them to take medication through religiously prohibited substances. Now, this is a big claim to make that you can actually use haram. But what are the dalil? What are the adillah for that? How do we come to this conclusion? Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in Surah Al-An'am, verse 119, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم وقد فصل لكم ما حرم عليكم إلا ما اضطررتم إليه. He has explained to you in detail that which is forbidden on you, except that to which you are compelled. So basically, this verse is telling us that even the specifically prohibited things, they can become permissible in case of necessity, right? And medical treatment can be a necessity. So it's not always a necessity. Sometimes it's just mubah to do so, but sometimes it becomes necessary. And when it becomes necessary and you don't have halal alternatives, then prohibited substances can be used as a form of treatment. Not with the Quran. We have the deal from Sunnah as well. And so it's mentioned about the people of the tribe of Urayna. So they came to Medina, but yes, the air of Medina didn't suit them, or the climate was not for them. And so they got really sick. And so the Prophet ﷺ instructed them uh, to drink from the milk and the urine of camels, right? And they did, and they regained their health. And it goes on to mention other things that they did and what the Prophet Islam, as punishment, did to them. However, we know that the urine of camels is impure. So the instruction of the Prophet ﷺ basically is giving us the indication that this was the only way of ilaj for them. And so that's why, because in case of necessity, he allowed for it to happen. Right? Now, there's a big question is that at the beginning, we mentioned two hadith in which it is explicitly mentioned that in the first hadith of Salama, the Prophet Islam mentioned, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَمْ يَجْعَلْ شِفَاءَكُمْ فِي مَا حَرَّمَ عَلَيْكُمْ. There is no cure in that which is haram. And the other hadith of Abu Darda radiallahu anhu, the Prophet Islam mentioned, إِنَّ اللَّهَ أَنزَلَ الدَّاءَ وَالدَّوَاءَ. Both the cure and the disease is sent down by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. At the end of the hadith, he mentions, وَلَا تَدَاوَوا بِحَرَامٍ, and don't medicate with haram. So how do we reconcile between these two uh, groups, or these two files of adillah? One in which we say it might be permissible to use haram as medication. In the other, we have explicit hadith telling us that there is no shifa in haram, and then do not use haram as medication. Well, the way the scholars have interpreted these two hadith in order to balance out all of the adillah is to say that these two are the prohibition in these two hadith of Salama and Abu Darda radiallahu anhuma is regarding the treatment with intoxicants. That is one way they reconcile. That this is specific, these two hadith are specific in treatment with intoxicants. And so, as we'll come to know, that intoxicants within the haram category of substances is more agreed upon. There are more number of people who say that you cannot use intoxicants as a means of cure. While they may allow other haram substances to be used as a means of medication, those scholars do not allow intoxicants as a means of medication. So that's one interpretation to reconcile between these different hadith. The other way is that these two hadith are in the case when a person is not in hal of zarura, when there's no zarura. So when there's no zarura, need and necessity, in that case, it is haram to medicate with these things, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not created them as medicine. Right? So in the case of need, in the case of isdirar, they won't be haram. Right? And obviously, being halal, these haram things being halal in that time of necessity, does not really mean that it is that you're being pushed to do it, or that this is something that the Sharia encourages you to do. Right? Rather, a person's first intuition should always be to try to find some halal alternative to their situation. Now let's come to التداوي بالأدوية المحتوية على الكحول. So alcohol as a means of medication. What is the hukum behind it? Well, if it's pure alcohol, pure wine, then its use is impermissible as a medicine. For the hadith of Salama radiallahu anha that we mentioned previously. And also of another hadith by Tariq ibn Suwaid al-Hazrami radiallahu anhu that he mentions that I said to the Prophet Islam, Ya Rasulullah, Inna bi arzina a'naman na'tasiruha fanashrabu minha. That, Ya Allah, we have, that, Ya Rasulullah, we have grapes in our land and we squeeze the juice out of them and drink it. So can we do that as wine? The Prophet ﷺ mentioned, La, you're not allowed. And then فراجعته قلت إنا نستشفي به للمريض. Then he said, I came back to the Prophet ﷺ and said that we use it for treating our diseased. On which he was replied, إن ذلك ليس بشفاء ولكنه داء. It is not a cure, it is not a treatment, rather it is a disease. Right? So if it's pure alcohol, then by the Nas of Hadith, it is not a form of cure, it is a disease. And so brandy, for example, was used was used as a cough medication previously. Islamically, it would have been impermissible because it was pure alcohol. Right? But if it's not pure alcohol, if it's medicine that does contain some form of alcohol, if it's a really small percentage, then obviously it's not prohibited for use. And neither would you say that this medication is impure if the amount of alcohol is very less of it. Right? As for the Hanafiya, in their position, except for if it's alcohol other than grape and dates, it's not najis in the first place, not impure in the first place. So it's not a big deal on their madhab. As for the other Aimma, they suggest that every alcohol is najis, but in the case of medication, they say that it is okay, it won't be considered najis through the principle of istihlak. Istihlak is basically when you say that a small amount of something dissolves and its hukum vanishes in a large amount of something else. So if qalil min al-najis or qalil min al-haram is mixed with a very high quantity of halal, so much that it that najis or haram thing actually loses all of its athar, all of its essence and effect, it's going to be as if it never existed, which means that as if your entire thing was halal and it was pure, right? So whenever a small amount of alcohol is mixed, the resulting liquid will not be causing intoxication, right? And because intoxication itself was the illah and the rationale behind the prohibition of alcohol in the first place, this mixture would not carry the same ruling as that of alcohol, neither in terms of prohibition nor in terms of impurity, right? But remember, there are three conditions that allow for the use of alcohol as medication. Number one, there should not be an alcohol free alternative to that medicine. Number two, that a competent, trustworthy Muslim physician should advise the use of this medicine. And number three, that you can only consume that amount of such medication as long as it does not lead to intoxication. Okay, so these three conditions, and in accordance with this, the Islamic fiqh councils and the fatwas issued by them have sanctioned the use of medicines containing a small quantity of alcohol, while also making it very clear that it is not the preferred method, but only in the case of necessity do they allow it. Right? And so the Al-Majma' al-Fiqh al-Islami التابع لرابطة العالم الإسلامي, it mentions, based on the provisions within the Sharia of removing difficulty, دفع الحرج, uh, alleviating hardship, repelling harm, دفع الضرر, بما أمكن, and all the other different maxims that we studied at the beginning of this text. So, keeping all those in mind, the following resolution has been determined and reached by the Council. Number one, it is prohibited to use pure wine as cure in all circumstances because of the Prophet Islam's hadith. إن الله لم يجعل شفاءكم فيما حرم عليكم. And also, إن الله أنزل داء ودواء فتداووا ولا تداووا بحرام. And also because of the hadith of Tariq ibn Suwaid, إنه ليس بدواء ولكنه داء. Number two, it is permissible to use medicines containing alcohol of a small proportion in accordance with the practices of the pharmaceutical industry when there is no alternative. Number one, provided that such a medicine is prescribed by a trustworthy doctor. Number two, and it is also permissible to use alcohol as an external disinfectant for wounds, as sanitizer, creams, and external liquids. We already talked about that. The Islamic Fiqh Council advises pharmaceutical companies and pharmacists in Islamic countries, as well as drug importers, to exert the best efforts to exclude alcohol from medicines and use other alternatives. And resolution number four, the Fiqh Council also advises doctors to refrain from prescribing alcohol containing medicines whenever possible. Right? So a Muslim patient can use medicines containing a proportion of alcohol if there is not an alternative, alcohol-free alternative, and also if it's prescribed by a trustworthy and honest doctor, Muslim doctor. That is the hukum of tadawi bi al-alcohol. Thirdly, we'll discuss about narcotics, al-mukhaddarat. Well, the normative ruling in mukhaddarat is also impermissibility for the same reasons that we mentioned above. But in the case of zarura, the ulama have given permission with a few conditions, of course. Number one, the treatment with narcotics is prescribed by a trustworthy, competent Muslim physician. Number two, there is no alternative medication to that narcotic as a form of treatment. Number three, the intention should not be to circumvent the Sharia prohibition of narcotic, right? So your intention should be medication and not then you can get a high. And number four, that it should be used according to necessity. It should not exceed the necessary. So if the narcotic containing medicine has no alternative and is that is free of narcotic or other Islamically prohibited substances like alcohol and haram, gelatin example, then it would be permissible for the patient to use it, provided that it was determined to be beneficial by a Muslim doctor whose religiousness and scientific knowledge can be trusted. Allah says, as the conclusion of the verse that lists prohibited foods, فَمَنِ اضْطُرَّ غَيْرَ بَاغٍ وَلَا عَادٍ فَلَا إِثْمَ عَلَيْهِ. But whoever is forced by necessity, neither desiring the haram nor transgressing the limits when consuming the haram, there is no sin upon such a person. Uh, إِنَّ اللَّهَ غَفُورٌ عَفُوٌّ غَفُورٌ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most forgiving, merciful. Number four, we'll talk about those medicines which has gelatin as the main ingredient, as an ingredient. So what is gelatin? So gelatin is a translucent, colorless, flavorless, insoluble substance that is extracted from the hides, tissues, or bones of animals by means of a lengthy boiling process in water or by other chemical processes. Right? So it's basically a form of protein. Gelatin is a form of protein that is extracted from um, in different parts of the animal's body. What is the hukum of gelatin? Well, if gelatin is taken from an animal which is ma'ulul laham, which you can consume, that has been slaughtered bizakat ash-shar'iyya according to Islamic principles, right? In that case, that gelatin is pure and you can use it for the purpose of medicine and for other things as well. But if the gelatin was extracted from a haram animal, for example, the khinzir or a carrion, or a halal animal, but it has not gone through the zabiha process, but was still in another fashion, then in this case, generally it is haram to take medication that has been made using such gelatin. For the hadith of the Prophet Islam, إن الله أنزل الداء والدواء وجعل لكل داء دواء فتداووا لا تداووا بحرام. Now let's talk about the use of gelatin involving medicine. We'll talk about both internal use and external use. So first, let's talk about external internal use of medication uh, that include substances derived from the parts of swine, right? So you have al-insulin al-khinziri, uh, porcine insulin, right? So the majority of the scholars are in the opinion that it is haram to medicate with porcine insulin, except in the case of necessity with the conditions prescribed by the Sharia parameters, which are number one, that the patient is in a condition where it is feared that they might die or suffer significant harm. Second parameter, that no alternative to porcine insulin is available. And number three is that it is prescribed by a trustworthy and competent physician. And the proponents of this opinion, they rely on the opinion that we previously mentioned, and that it is permissible to do tadawi bil muharramat in the case of necessity, right? And so their adilla are the same that we've previously mentioned. Uh, Number two are capsules made from porcine gelatin, porcine gelatin, right? So it is permissible, according to some jurists, to use medicines whose enclosing capsules are made with porcine gelatin on the condition that bones, tissues, and skin have been completely transformed chemically, such that both the name and the nature of the substance has changed. A term that in the halal industry we use as istihala, which means that if something leaves its original form and transforms entirely, just like the caterpillar entirely transforms into a new creature, the butterfly. So when such a transformation takes place, the things extracted from the pig are no longer those same things. And if something like this happens, if istihala takes place, then it is permissible to use it. And those Muslim jurists who actually take this opinion, they base it on the majority of the opinion of the majority of the jurists who say that impure substances become pure through istihala. Although the book mentions it as chemical transformation, the reality is that the process of istihala, what constitutes as istihala, is actually a mukhtalaf fihi masala. It's a very debatable masala between the ulama. But anyhow, if istihala takes place, the ulama say that impure can become pure. And so capsules made out of khinzir gelatin, if istihala is taking place, can be permissible for consumption. What about external use? Well, uh, modern fuqaha or contemporary Islamic jurists have two different opinions regarding ointments and creams that contain porcine derivatives. The preferred opinion is that it is permissible to use such ointments and creams because these ingredients have been completely transformed based on the view that chemical transformation is a means of purification. But obviously, it is better to avoid if you have other alternatives. So, in the view that istihala means chemical transformation, using such creams would be permissible, right? It would be permissible. Because the thing that is forbidden, is the بقاء حكم الخبث. A, when the name is different, when the characteristics of something is different, then obviously it's not the same thing. It's something entirely different. And so, in other words, what you could say is that the hukum of something is associated with the name it's given and the characteristics that it possesses. So the hurma of khinzir is with its name when that something is understood as khinzir, and with the characteristics that the khinzir has. When you've chemically gone through an entire process, it's no longer in the same physical shape, it doesn't have the same chemical properties, then it doesn't have the same name nor the same characteristics. It's not the same thing anymore. So the hukum was associated with something, that something no longer exists, and so the hukum is also going to change. Up till now, we talked about ajza made from khinzir. Now we'll talk about ingredients made from other non-consumable animals, like those animals whose consumption is not halal in Islam. So the normal hukum is ingredients that are derived from these animals. So there's some disconnect in this book. There's a page missing, actually. Actually, no, it's not a page missing. It is actually a mistake here. So ingredients that are derived from animals whose consumption is not allowed in Islam. It's not allowed. It's not allowed in Islam. Is permissible to use in medication. Um, Normative hukum is not permissible to use in medication, except in the case of zarura. uh, Consumption anyways, but if it's used on your outer body, that would be permissible. As far as halal animals are concerned, right, slaughtered the halal way, their use is permissible in medication, right? But again, with the following stipulations: number one, that the use of that medicine is necessary and is used to the minimum extent necessary, right? الضرورة تتقدر بقدر الضرورة. Second, it is only permissible after exerting reasonable effort and due diligence that no other halal alternative is available, or that the halal alternative would be extremely difficult to obtain, right? Uh, المشقة تجلب التيسير, hardship brings ease. And the third condition is that the medicine must be prescribed by a trustworthy, competent physician, right? Now, what are some of the medicines that are used? So first is we have heparin, right? And heparin is a well-known medicine used by physicians as an anticoagulant in case of heart disease, angina, and thrombosis, amongst many other uses. So what it does, it thins the blood so it does not clot, right? It's a blood thinner uh, that prevents blood clotting, right? So it is used for both prevention and cure, and heparin is naturally produced by the human body, but it can be derived from external sources and administered to patients when that is needed. So sometimes the human body is not producing enough of heparin or has stopped producing it at all. And so that's why you would need it externally, right? Now, there are two types of heparin. You have standard heparin, also known as unfractionated heparin, UFH. It is a polydispersed heterogeneous sulfated polysaccharide, no chemical jargon. What happens is that it's extracted from animal tissue that is rich in blood vessels such as lungs and intestinal mucosa of cows and pigs, right? Wherever there's a lot of blood vessels, you can obtain this from there. However, this type is not considered ideal due to its side effects. Uh, because it is mojave in blood vessels, it's extracted from where there's a lot of blood, and the blood can contain a lot of materials not suitable for human consumption. So that is why it is ideal not to use heparin taken from those areas because it could have potential harms. The second type is the low molecular weight heparin. That is extracted from standard heparin by chemical process, right? So you take the first form, then you basically take it through a filter process in which you remove any harmful substances from it. And this forms a new compound which is different in both its physical and chemical properties. And then it goes through the process we call istihala transformation, as mentioned, and thus it should become permissible. Right? The Islamic Fiqh Council of the Muslim World League, أي مجمع الفقه الإسلامي التابع لرابطة العالم الإسلامي. So after extensive deliberation devoted specifically to this topic, the use of heparin, they issued the following resolution in light of scholarly research, along with the Sharia principles of removing difficulty, alleviating hardships, proportionate repelling of harm, and all the other maxims that necessity permits prohibited things, and a lighter harm is tolerated for the sake of repelling a greater harm. What the conclusion they reached and the resolution they came up was with number one, it is permissible to use for treatment the new type of heparin, i.e., the LMWH, in the absence of a halal alternative that would obviate the need for it, finish the need for it, if the halal alternative would prolong the process of achieving reform. Number two, it should not be used in excess, rather, it should be used according to the extent of necessity. If a pure alternative is found, it should be used. That alternative should be used. Or this is the default rule, as we have discussed previously again and again. And also to take account of the juristic disagreement as to whether or not istihala took place, or istihala can result in purification. The Council also recommends that ministries of health in Islamic countries should coordinate with heparin manufacturing companies. And with that, we come to the end of chapter 5. And chapter 6 is all about medical consent, which is one of the most important ethics that anyone working in the care industry should be wary about, right? Al-majalisu bil amana, whatever happens in a certain majlis, is to remain in that majlis. And it's not just for medical settings, it's for normal everyday lives as well. But the importance of it in a medical condition increases twofold, right? And so chapter 6 is all about medical consent. And what is the definition? Well, lexically, the Arabic term for consent is the word idhin, permission, right? And conveying information. But technically, the jurists use it the word idhin, uh, to describe permission that has been defined as authorization or endorsement. Idhin is basically uh, any sort of permission uh, given to you by an authority. Or other, you could say that someone has exclusive rights to something which nobody other than them can uh, talk about, and permission would be granting you permission to that exclusivity. Right? So consent in the medical field refers to understanding and agreement of the patient or his guardian, in case of there being a minor, or a patient and their proxy, to medical procedures necessary for his treatment. Right? So a doctor cannot perform on that person in normal circumstances any surgery or treatment until they have permission. But this comes back to the very first discussion on medicine, whether or not medicating and seeking treatment is necessary. If it's fard, if it's wajib, then which it becomes in some cases, then you cannot force a patient, and then you can actually force a patient even without their will. But in normal circumstances, seeking medication is mubah, and at most it's just mustahab, and you cannot force someone in mustahab, and that's why consent is necessary. Okay, so what is the importance of consent anyway? Well, it is necessary that medical treatment be administered with consent of the patient or the guardian or the proxy, because if it's administered without consent and it results that the physician's actions are considered as a transgression, yani if something bad happens, if there's a harm or damage that results from this treatment without consent, then the physician would be legally liable for it, right? Furthermore, the patient has the right to choose his or her own doctor, right? If they're in a condition that their health allows them to, no doctor can force themselves upon a patient. The patient will have the right to choose, because more uncommonly known or less discussed is that the process of healing is not just that medicine or not just the surgery. Uh, the process of healing also involves the trust that a patient has with their doctor, right? The kind of communication that the patient has with their doctor. That also plays a key role in the recovery of a patient. And so that is why consent is necessary, that the patient should be able to trust their doctor. And interestingly enough, we find within the books of fiqh explicit furur in which the fuqaha have mentioned that it is mandatory to obtain the consent from the patient, his proxy or guardian. And this is to limit the physician's liability. Because if every time a physician makes a mistake and you make them liable, then no one's going to practice medicine of the fear that I might always be penalized for it. And so that's why the fuqaha have mentioned if it's done by consent and the physician does his best not to do it properly and then a harm results, he's not accountable, she's not accountable. But if there's no consent and or it's proven that they weren't serious when doing surgery, when doing treating the patient, or there was a deliberate blunder from their side, then they will be held accountable for it. What is the ruling of medical consent? Well, the doctor must obtain consent for treatment from the patient themselves or the legal guardian or proxy, the evidence for which is the following hadith of the Prophet Islam mentioned in Sahih Bukhari and as Muslim as well. Aisha radiallahu anha, she mentions, We administered medicine into the mouth of the messenger of Allah against his will during his illness. This was near his time of death. Although he gestured us not to do so, but because he was sick, we did that. We thought because it's natural that a sick person does not want medication, right? So that's why the Prophet Islam, he made gestures to not to do it, but we did it anyways. Once the Prophet Islam regained consciousness, complete sense of what was happening around him, he said, medicine should be poured into the mouth of everyone in the house except Abbas. I asked punishment for you forcefully pouring down medicine in my throat when I explicitly told you not to. As punishment, everyone should drink that medicine, except for Abbas radiallahu anhu because he wasn't there. Right? So this hadith clearly tells us that consent from an adult sane person is essential before administering any medical treatment, and that if the patient refuses, whether explicitly by speech or by gesture, then he has the right to do so. Right? So in which case, compelling him would be a form of transgression subject to punitive measures. That's number one. Number two is not permissible to obtain consent by means of coercion, nor by material incitement, because this obviously the case is not pure consent. It has been colluded either by coercion or by being bribed into doing so, right? So medical personnel should not exploit the situation of a person, right? For example, they should not be forcing an incarcerated, imprisoned person to undergo treatment or taking advantage of the financially needy and poor, the destitute, or the homeless by inciting them with money in exchange for conducting experiments on them. This is very important, especially when it comes to medical research. It's also recommended that the patient be that is supposed to give consent to undergo an Islamically justified surgery. So, as we previously described, it is mustahab to seek medication, as Osama ibn Sharik mentioned that some Bedouins came to the Prophet asking about medical treatment, whether they should seek it or not. The Prophet Islam, he mentioned, make use of medical treatment, for Allah has not revealed a disease except for making a remedy of it as well. There are some exceptions, however, to this medical consent. Um, right, so the different cases in which requirement for consent is dropped. Let's discuss some of them. Number one is cases involving public welfare. Right? So these include infectious diseases that can threaten the community, either because of their severity or because of rapid spread of infection among people. Right? In such cases, the government has the right to impose treatment on patients in order that the community at large not be harmed. So, in the cases of administering COVID-19 vaccines or quarantine, right, you can actually override the consent hukum and apply these measures for public welfare, right? Yes, every possible measure should be taken to prevent the patient from transmitting the disease the healthy, even if they don't consent to it, because public welfare overrides private interests. This is another maxim in the Sharia that in order to achieve public good in a justified manner, private uh, benefits or private interests are overridden. And also, harm must be eliminated وَلَا ضَرَّ وَلَا ضِرَارَ, neither will you harm nor will you be harmed, considering all of these other maxims as well. um, a person's consent can be taken away. Number two is critical cases. So these cases include where there's a danger to the patient's life or the survival or function of one of his organs is at risk and the patient is unconscious. You can't really ask for their consent, and their proxy or guardian are either unavailable or you can't reach them. Or maybe the person is in a psychological condition that does not allow for soliciting his permission, insanity, for example. Example of this is severe appendicitis, right? So if there's a fear that the appendix is going to burst and then potentially cause the death of the patient, unless urgently appendectomy is performed and the appendix is removed, right? In this case, surgery may be permissible even without consent. Or, for example, in the case that there is a terrible accident, a medical crash, and people are coming in the ER department, and we really don't have time to ask about people or whether or not there were relatives nearby or anything. We'll just have to perform surgery snap in the moment, like trauma surgeons do. Then in that case, consent won't be required to save the life of a person. Near drowning survivors, people who've been severely injured in a fire, collapse of building, car accidents, etc. So basically, trauma surgery is completely permissible, completely okay to do. In such cases, it is permissible for the doctor to proceed without the consent of the patient or his guardian proxy, because any delay would lead to preponderant harm or damage. And the maxims that we know, it's you have to avoid that. All right, and another exception to the rule of consent is minor procedures on children. So it is customary to provide medical care to children without the need to obtain their consent or of their guardians, or when it comes to simple treatments administered to sick or injured people, right? Or required by vaccinations that are usually carried out in the school by the nurses. Band-aiding the child, giving him cough medicine or fever medicine, things like that. The early Muslim scholars addressed such cases and stated that there is no need to obtain consent in such cases. Now, the next point of discussion is what are the requirements of a valid consent? Well, for medical consent to be valid, the following conditions must be fulfilled. Number one, the consent must be given by someone who has the right to issue it, usually the patient themselves. But if this is not possible, then the consent of the patient's guardian or proxy should be sought. In some cases, the permission of one who is responsible for the nation may suffice, like in terms of, applying quarantine or administering vaccination. Therefore, consent given by anyone else will not be valid. For example, if a patient's brother gives consent for surgery on his brother and he's neither the guardian or proxy, his consent will be considered null and void, right? Because normally the brother does not have authority in these circumstances. Number two, the person who gives consent must be legally competent according to the Sharia, which means they must be an adult of sound mind. Thus, if the patient's consent is invalid because either they're not adult or they're not of sound mind, then it would be permissible. The third is the consent must be given freely without any influence, whether through coercion, whether through means of monetary bribes or anything else, or even undue influence, right? Because any permission issued by a person under compulsion is considered invalid based on the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Uh, In 16th chapter, verse 106. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, um, من كفر بالله من بعد إيمانه إلا من أكره وقلبه مطمئن بالإيمان. Whoever disbelieves in Allah after his belief, except for the one who is forced to renounce his religion, while his heart is still secure in faith. And this word indicates that anyone who is forced to say the words of disbelief or blasphemy, while the heart is still mu'min, is not a disbeliever. And from this, jurists can deduce that coercion removes accountability for belief. So it is more appropriate that coercion also removes accountability more in lesser important matters. Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu mentions that the Prophet Islam said, uh, تجاوز الله عن أمتي الخطأ والنسيان وما استكرهوا عليه, and that which they were forced to do against their will, that is something that Allah has forgiven. Thus, words and actions from a person under coercion are not taken into consideration. Consent is included in those words. Number four is that the treatment for which consent is given should be permissible according to Sharia. Therefore, the patient's consent is null and void if he consents, for example, for having a tattoo procedure or a gender assignment, reassignment surgery or lip augmentation, right? Any haram form of medication surgery, consent in such a case is thrown out of the window. It's unacceptable. And number five is the person giving consent must be aware of the nature and consequence of the treatment. So if the doctor says I need to perform surgery, you can't just give consent. You need to know what you're giving consent to, how that you can make a more viable decision. The last discussion in this chapter is when is the consent terminated? I give you consent to perform surgery. Till when does this consent last? Well, the answer to that is medical consent is deemed to end in the following cases. Case number one, then its stipulated duration ends. Any treatment after that requires new consent. You performed the surgery, consent ended. Now for other surgery, corrective surgery or a checkup surgery, you would need a new consent. Case number two is when the patient is cured from the disease that was being treated, and so healing is deemed to terminate the consent. Number three, death of the patient. And number four is when a person giving consent does not have the legal capacity to do so. So either that person, but the only case that would be that person becomes uh, not of sound mind, become insane, lose consciousness, etc. What does the Islamic Council have to say about patient's consent? What are their pronouncements? Well, they mention A, the patient's consent to medical treatment is essential if the patient has full legal capacity to it, which means they're adult and of sane mind. If they lack such capacity, either partially or fully, the consent of his legal guardian or proxy is to be considered in accordance with the hierarchy of guardianship in the Sharia, which is determined by the hierarchy in Mirath. We've discussed this quite a few times. And this is subject to the usual restriction that the guardian's consent should be given in the best interest of the patient. If the guardian does not give consent for a treatment or surgery, the non-performance of which would result in harm for the patient, and this is very clear that it's going to result in harm, then the guardian's decision will be deemed void, and the right of consent shall be transferred to the next person in the hierarchy, and ultimately to the sultan, because as-sultanu waliyyun liman la waliyya lah. Number two, the ruler has the right to oblige treatment in some cases, such as in the cases of contagious diseases and preventative immunizations. Number C, in critical cases when life of the victim is in danger, medical treatment shall not be contingent upon consent. And lastly, when carrying out medical research, it is imperative to obtain the consent of a subject who has full legal capacity. This consent should be devoid of coercion, as in the case of incarcerated persons, and financial enticement, as in the case of the poor. Moreover, the research must not involve any harm. It is not permissible to carry out medical research on persons that lack legal capacity, even if the guardians consent, right? So experiments with children, especially medical experiments, are impermissible. مطلقا. والله أعلم بالصواب.